if you want to use the mic, you can use the mic. Okay. All right, well, welcome everybody to our lecture today on behalf of the Ryan Center. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to just make a brief announcement about an upcoming lecture that the Ryan Center will be co-sponsoring with the Humanities Department. And this lecture will be by Philip Blond, Director of the London think tank Res Publica, and policy consultant at Tory party leader David Cameron. And the title of that lecture is Red Toryism, a genuine alternative to the market state. And that will be Monday, March 22nd, 7:30 p.m. in Driscoll Hall. So you can look forward to that. I'd just like to start by thanking the Ryan Center and the Villanova Center for Liberal Education, in particular the learning communities, the Politics of Freedom learning community, for sponsoring this lecture. The Matthew Ryan Center was founded in order to promote inquiry into the principles and processes of free government, and seeks to advance understanding of the responsibilities of statesmen and citizens of constitutional democratic societies. What better way to honour the principles of a free government than by having a lecture on one of the founders of modern liberal democracy, if you like, liberal democratic government, John Locke. Our speaker, Michael Zuckert, is one of my own, was my advisor, and I guess you could say is continuing as my advisor even after I've graduated from Notre Dame. And Michael is chair currently of the Department of Political Science at Notre Dame, the Nancy Dreux Professor of Political Science. And he has had a very extensive teaching experience in different places. He got his BA from Cornell in 1964 and his MA and PhD from University of Chicago in 1967 and 1974. Since then, he taught for quite a while at Carleton College from 1968 to 98. And in between, he served as visiting professor in quite a few different schools, actually. Fordham, Michigan, University of Michigan, Cornell, Claremont Men's College. So he's been in many different places. And I think, I would say that I find Michael to be a very impressive scholar and mentor. He has published quite extensively on issues pertaining to, obviously John Locke and the American founding. But there's a breadth to his thinking that is quite impressive. Some of the titles of his publications include Natural Rights and American Constitutionalism, which is forthcoming, Completing the Constitution, the Civil War Amendments, also forthcoming, the Anti-Federal Writings of the Melanchthon Smith Circle, co-edited with Derek Webb, The Truth About Leo Strauss, Political Philosophy in American Democracy, co-authored with his wife Catherine Zuckert, Protestantism and the American Founding, co-authored and co-edited, Launching Liberalism, John Locke and the Liberal Tradition, The Natural Rights Republic, Natural Rights and the New Republicanism, and Machiavelli and Shakespeare, a collection of essays that he's co-edited, that he's editing. So you could see quite a span of interests there. And what I've been impressed by in Michael's kind of thinking and approach to things, a few things. One is, as I say, the breadth of his thinking and interests that span over quite a few different topics, rigor and attention to detail, and a real fair-mindedness when dealing with points of view that he may not necessarily share, which is something to be appreciated in academics, I would say in general, because it's not necessarily the most common thing in academics. Also a first-rate mentor to his students, past and present. And I think it's a testament to that, the fact that he's probably one of the most popular thesis advisors at Notre Dame. Now, I guess I would just mention, as far as the relevance of Locke to American culture, just a little thing that happened to me recently that really made me think that Locke, in some way, Locke is still, we're breathing Locke in our culture. I went out of my apartment building and I noticed chairs in all of the parking spaces, so I couldn't park because there were chairs blocking all the spaces. And I thought to myself, okay, obviously I was teaching John Locke, so I thought obviously they're thinking they've mixed their labour with the snow, right? Because they've dug out these spaces, so now they claim them for themselves. And these spaces lie vacant for 7, 8, 9 hours every day because they've mixed their labour with the snow and they own the spaces. So I decided this morning to put this to the test a little bit, and I saw a spot that had been duly occupied by a chair, and in a fit of passionate rage, I took the chair and I put it to the side and I parked my car. And also set a sense of injustice. Later I found this note on my car, which I think is again a testament to the enduring influence of John Locke in our culture. And I'm going to just quote this to you before I hand you over to Professor Zuckert, who's going to maybe explain to us why this is still so influential. Quote, "I put the chair there for a reason. I spent 2 days shoveling that spot for my car. This is my home. Please do not move the chair." The title of the lecture is The Lockean Republic, America in Light of Lockean Philosophy.
Thank you.
David, thank you for that introduction. And David's right. I am the Reeves Dreux Professor of Political Science at Notre Dame. I have aspirations for better things than that. I'm shooting to become the Harry Potter Professor, which I suspect will have a much more perquisites than Nancy Drew. I mean, she's important, but not quite up there with Harry Potter. I am delighted to be here. I'm delighted that the weather let up enough to allow me to arrive here. I've never been here to Villanova before, so it's a treat to come and see this place, this beautiful room where we have this lecture. As I told my old friend Colleen Sheen, if I had known there was such a great setup here, I would have brought all kinds of PowerPoint, but I didn't know we'd have it, so I didn't, so I'm sorry. I have never been here, but I have lots of friends here, many sitting in the front row there, and so it's great to be here back in their home turf. And I'm grateful to them to have invited me. As David said, the topic or the title of my talk is The Lockean Republic, America in Light of Lockean Philosophy, and my beginning point, my point of departure for this is a saying that one sometimes heard, I don't know if you've ever heard it, but Locke has been called America's philosopher. And what I want to do in my talk today is actually to explore two topics or two questions which are related to that claim that Locke is America's philosopher. The first question would be this: what might that mean? Why might we say that? What is the basis for Locke being given that kind of credit for a whole society, a great big society like this one? And secondly, assuming that one can come up with a good answer to that first question, I want to raise a second question, which is, was it an error? That is, was it first a theoretical error and then a practical error for Americans or America to adopt Locke as their philosopher, that is, to take guidance from him? So, for example, for people to claim parking places on the basis of mixing their labor with the snow. Otherwise put, was Locke or is Locke a good guide or inspiration for us? That's question. I'm not going to, I want to say at the beginning, I'm not going to answer that completely. I'm just going to answer a small piece of that. So let me turn first to the first question, which is, why might it be said that Locke is America's philosopher? I mean, what can it even mean for a nation to have a philosopher? Well, this could be a complicated question, but I'm going to deal with it in a simple-minded way. I'm going to limit myself first to talking about at least in the beginning part of my talk, about the founding period, that is the revolution, the making of the Constitution, and so on, and not at first address the question whether Locke is still, in some sense or other, America's philosopher, although David's already settled that for us. And secondly, in trying to answer the question, what it might mean to say Locke is America's philosopher, I'm going to take as evidence of Locke's place some pretty straightforward things. Things like the presence of Lockean ideas in documents, texts, sayings, writings of important political actors of the founding era, And I'm also going to try to look for evidence of Lockeanism, Lockean ideas in the broader political culture, so far as I can do that in a short time. Now, the most clear-cut evidence of Locke's presence in the founding period, it comes from a very scientific survey that was made some years ago, in which the author studied all the pamphlets that had been written, all the texts that had been written at the time, and he counted up the citations or the references to different authors. And the winner for the whole revolutionary period was John Locke, except for the Bible. The Bible was more often cited than Locke, but other than the Bible, Locke was the most cited author of the revolutionary period. And that, the identification of explicit citations to Locke far understates the actual presence of Locke, because the people who were writing, pamphlet writers and others of that time, must have missed out on that lecture that you get when you first arrive at Villanova about plagiarism. Yes, do you get that lecture here? Okay. They must have missed out on the lecture about plagiarism, because pamphleteers then, more often than not, used material that they borrowed or actually just stole from other writers without proper citations, often without any kind of citation whatever. So if the cited presence of Locke is great, the uncited presence is much greater than that. Perhaps the most striking evidence of the uncited presence, I should say, of Locke is that document that made America a free and independent nation. I mean, the Declaration of Independence. One scholar who has looked into this question said the following. He said, Locke lurks behind the Declaration's every phrase. Pretty strong claim. And it does not take a sophisticated computer program to find evidences of Locke's presence in the Declaration of Independence. And all of this without one footnote or mention of Locke's name, I should say, for sure. Let me mention the following phrases from the Declaration that are identical, or nearly identical, to language in Locke's second treatise. And I know many of you have read Locke's second treatise recently, so you'll recognize many of these phrases, I'm sure. First, all men are created equal. Second, the laws of nature and nature's God. To dissolve these bands, to secure these rights, deriving its just powers from the consent of the governed. The right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new governments. The frames to which they are accustomed. Mankind are more disposed to suffer. And then finally, the long train of abuses. And I'm sure there are even more than that. Those are just the ones that I picked out on a kind of quick and casual look. This is a pretty formidable list. And if Jefferson, the author of the Declaration, were brought up before a disciplinary board on plagiarism, he wouldn't have much of a leg to stand on. What he would say, in fact, what he did say when he was accused much later of having copied from Locke, what he did say is that I never claimed to say anything original in the Declaration of Independence. All I was trying to do was to make it, this is a quotation, an expression of the American mind. This was his defense. I merely wanted to express the American mind. That is, as Jefferson saw it, these ideas no longer belonged to Locke, but they belonged to the entire American mind of his time. Now, the Lockean ideas that Jefferson thought to be so present in the American mind of that time transcended these specific phrases that I've just mentioned to you, but included, or rather centered on, the general structure of Lockean thought that we find in the Declaration. And I want to restate that general structure by telling or retelling what I think is the narrative or the little story that the main theoretical, the important part of the Declaration tries to tell. What the Declaration wants to do is to tell us how legitimate government comes to be, in what it consists, and what can be done about political structures that have lost their legitimacy, as the British government had done at the time of the Revolution and the issuing of the Declaration. In order to do that, the Declaration posits a condition before rightful or legitimate government exists. This is a condition marked by equality, by which Locke and Jefferson both seem to mean the lack of all relations of authority, that is, of anybody having a right to command or order anybody around. It's also a condition, an original condition, in which human beings have rights. as the Declaration puts it, all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. This initial situation, it should be evident to those of you who have read Locke, corresponds to that opening moment in Locke's narrative, which he formally calls a state of nature, which is, as he puts it, a state of equality, that is, of no political authority, and a state where human beings possess rights. Now, according to Locke, as you recall, this state of nature is a very insecure place for rights because it quickly degenerates into a state of war in which rights become insecure. In order to overcome that insecurity, that is, in order to secure these rights, Locke tells us, human beings create governments, and they do so through what he calls a social contract, or what Jefferson in the Declaration calls through the consent of the governed. Now, Locke and the Declaration also agree about the sequel to all of this. That is, although framed to secure rights, governments can themselves become threats to rights in a number of different ways, actually. And when governments fail to secure rights, it is, we are told, right that the people have the right to alter or to abolish the government and to replace them with other ones that are better, that do the job that they're supposed to do. So Locke and the Declaration agree on the main elements of the political narrative of legitimacy. That is, an initial state of natural equality, the formation of government by a contract or consent in order to secure the rights that have become insecure in the state of nature, the possibility of tyranny, and the rightfulness of rebelling against that tyranny and making new government. This is the story that was firmly fixed in the American mind of 1776. That's what Jefferson was referring to when he said he was just trying to express the American mind. After the Revolution, the colonies, which were now states, faced the need to draw up new constitutions. And almost all of them prefaced their constitutions with something they called, usually, a Bill of Rights, which was actually not very much like what we think of as the Bill of Rights, what's attached to the U.S. Constitution, but was actually much more like the Declaration of Independence, because the Bills of Rights that they drew up contained a story or a theory about legitimacy of the same sort that the Declaration contains. So, for example, in one of the first ones, and one of the most influential, the one that George Mason drew out for the state of Virginia, began like this. It stated those rights which do pertain to men and their posterity as the basis and foundation of government. And the rights that were declared by Mason in this document are very close to, if not identical to those in Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, as he says, that all men have certain inherent natural rights, among which are the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. This Virginia statement was copied almost verbatim into the revolutionary Pennsylvania, if any of you were busy reading the Pennsylvania Declaration and Constitution, that was issued in August of 1776. The Delaware Declaration of Rights, which was adopted in September 1776, also appealed to the natural and inalienable rights and included the usual right to be protected in the enjoyment of life, liberty, and property, as well as they included a right to worship Almighty God according to the dictates of their own consciences and understandings. The New York Constitution of 1777 based itself on the rights of the people of New York to institute and establish such a government as they shall deem best calculated to secure the rights, liberties, and happiness of the good people of this colony. Vermont more or less followed Virginia in affirming the natural, inherent, and unalienable rights of men and insisting that all government ought to be instituted and supported to enable the individuals who compose it to enjoy their natural rights. And like the Continental Congress that issued the Declaration of Independence, the Vermonters recognized that, and I'm quoting, whenever those great ends of government are not obtained, the people have a right to change it and to take such measures as to them may appear necessary to promote their safety and happiness. And then finally, the last two of the revolutionary constitutions, the Constitution of Massachusetts, adopted in 1780, could hardly have highlighted these Lockean themes more than it did. Here's what this says. This text was written by John Adams. The end of the institution of government is to secure the existence of the body politic, to protect it, and to furnish the individuals who compose it with the power of enjoying in safety and tranquility their natural rights and the blessings of life. The first article of the Constitution declared the natural, essential, and inalienable rights that all men possess. And the list of rights is a familiar one: the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, in fine, that of seeking their safety and happiness. And then New Hampshire, 1784, the very last of the first wave of constitutions, spoke almost identically as did Massachusetts. So, as you might be beginning to get the picture, these Lockean ideas were indeed everywhere in the revolutionary period. Now, to make what could be a very long story a good deal shorter, let me just take one further example, and this one from the time of the making of the U.S. Constitution in 1787, 1788. Now, probably the best-known product of that effort was the Constitution itself, but I'd say the second best-known product was the document that's come down to us known as Federalist Number 10, the essay by James Madison defending the idea of an extended or large republic. And I understand that those of you in the class, whatever it's called, haven't actually gotten to Madison yet. Am I right? Even though you were scheduled to do so, but the snow or something got in the way. Is it?
No, it's coming.
Coming. All right, so preview. But I have been led to believe you would have read it already, so I hope what I say will make sense if you have it. The problem of Federalist Number 10, as you will see, is the possibility of majority tyranny. As Madison really raises this question, there may be, we're setting up a Republican. What about the problem of majority tyranny? Well, why does Madison think of majority tyranny is such a problem? The answer is because the constitutional system he is establishing is intended to operate according to the principle of majority rule. As such, like all majority rule systems, it has the inherent ability to deal with, in its normal constitutional procedures, to deal with threats that come from minorities. But the problem is, how does it deal with threats that come from majorities? It has no inherent mechanism to do that. So that's the problem Madison believed that he had discovered a very clever solution to, that he outlines in his theory of the extended republic, which I'm not going to actually reproduce for you, but you'll have a chance yourself to see the wonders of that soon. But the long and short of it is that Madison thought if the republic were large enough and operated in the way that he thought it could, the problem of majority tyranny could be solved. You wouldn't have tyrannous majorities, but without violating the principle of majority rule. And that for him was a very important qualification. You couldn't violate the principle of majority rule in order to solve the problem of majority tyranny. And so that's why he was very delighted with the solution he came up with. As he put it in some places, it was a Republican remedy to the problem of republicanism. Now, what is most of interest actually to us this afternoon is how Madison's Federalist Number 10 picks up on Lockean themes. That's our topic. Now, the most important affirmation, I would say, in all of Federalist Number 10 is the following. Everybody paying attention? The diversity in the faculties of men from which the rights of property arise is an insuperable obstacle to a uniformity of interests. The protection of these faculties is the first object of government. Now, I want to just emphasize the various points that Madison is making here. First, property rights arise from the faculties of men. And second, protecting these faculties and the rights to which they give rise is the first object of government. All right, two very important connected thoughts. Now, what Madison also calls attention to, both in what I read and in the rest of the paper, is this, that the diversity or the differences in these faculties lead to inequalities in property. Some acquire more, some acquire less. The inequality of property will provide constant occasions for a desire to interfere with property, that is, say, to redistribute it and equalize it. But, says Madison, the protection of those faculties and the rights that those faculties generate is, to repeat, the first object of government. Now, those of you who have read Chapter 5 of Locke's second treatise, the chapter on property, should notice how closely Madison is tracking Locke here. Property, according to Locke, derives from human labor, that is, the exercise of human faculties. Since property derives from labor, according to Locke, property is as dynamic as labor is. Higher levels of labor lead to greater production of wealth. The protection of property is not only the protection, says Locke, of rights that belong to individuals as a personal right, but it also serves the common good, that is the good of society as a whole, by leading to the production of greater wealth. Thus, when Madison and the other founders constructed this large republic that they did, against the example, I should say, of all previous successful republics, and against the teachings of all of the recognized experts in political science, they were doing so in service to this Lockean understanding of the relations between labor, rights, property, and the common good. So I hope you will grant me then that there's some good reason, maybe more than some, a lot of good reason, to believe the claim that Locke is, or at least was, America's philosopher. So that brings me to my second question, which is, was it an error, a theoretical and then a practical error, for Americans to take so much guidance from Locke? Was Locke, or is Locke, a good guide, a good inspiration? Now, Locke was, let's just say, for sure, America's philosopher. But he did not go unchallenged in that capacity. The challenges to Locke came in two recognizable ways. Actually, more than that, if you separate out what happens in the abstruse world of thought, where the philosophers were attacking him from early on. But if we look at practical life itself, it occurred in two recognizable ways, at least in America. I'm going to ignore the philosophers for now. The public challenges to Locke came in these two phases. First, in the era leading up to the Civil War. Now, this set of challenges, in retrospect, was very obvious and certainly to be expected, because Locke had proclaimed the natural freedom and equality of all human beings, and it was pretty quickly seen to be incompatible with the institution of slavery. Therefore, those Americans who were attached to slavery felt compelled to attack Locke and the Lockean ideas that were embedded in the American system. So men like John C. Calhoun, is that a name that's familiar to any of you? You know, he was the leading thinker, the leading ideologue for the Southern forces in the pre-Civil War period. John C. Calhoun denied that all men are created equal, and he pronounced slavery to be the foundation of civilization. That is, he thought we needed to break with Locke in order to have a decent, what he thought was a good society. My home state senator rose on the floor of the Senate to say that that Lockean truth that Jefferson had held to be self-evident, the Lockean truth that all men are created equal, he said that this was really a self-evident lie. So this slavery-inspired effort to drive Locke out of the American regime was rebuffed when men like Lincoln and others, leaders of the Free Soil Party, leaders of the Republican Party, came forward to reaffirm Lockean themes. Now, the new birth of freedom that Lincoln called for in his Gettysburg Address was to some degree then a rebirth of Lockeanism in the American mind. The second great challenge to Locke as America's philosopher came toward the end of the 19th century and extends actually into our own time. By the late 19th century, as you recall from your high school American history, if nowhere else, by the late 19th century, the combined forces of industrialization, urbanization, et cetera, I'm sure could all list all of these forces, had produced changes in American society that led ultimately to the emergence of serious reform movements, and let's for short call it populism and progressivism, two reform movements, which were attempts to get hold of the economic forces that were reshaping America during the Gilded Age. Now, the progressive era spawned an attack, or several attacks, against many inherited American institutions and against the founding principles, because these were seen to stand in the way of the reforms that were being sought by the progressives. Now, probably the most famous such attack, and I don't know if this is still something to talk about in your high schools or elsewhere, Probably the most famous attack was Charles Beard's attempt to puncture the founders in their Constitution in his book, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. In that book, he argued that the Constitution was a concerted effort to thwart the popular will, or to thwart popular majorities, for the sake of protecting the property interests of the class to which the founders themselves belonged. According to Beard, the best way to understand the founding is to look at the investment portfolios and the bank accounts of the founders and not at their political theories. Okay, that's Beard's view. Nonetheless, so he didn't pay a lot of attention to Locke. I guess that's the conclusion of that. But nonetheless, the progressive agenda included an attack on Locke and Lockean themes in American culture. And the themes that came most under attack, I think, were two. I have not made a scientific study of this, so I'm just top of my head, I think two. First, the idea of a state of nature as somehow the natural baseline for thinking about political life. And secondly, the Lockean idea carried over into the Madisonian Constitution that there is a natural right to property, which by its mere force set boundaries to the efforts to reform the economy, which the progressives were very eager to do. These two criticisms, in a way, granted that Locke had played a major role in shaping American political culture and American political institutions, but they posed the question, was this a good thing? Was Locke an adequate guide or shaper for us? Now, the critics, who I have in mind, saw the idea of a state of nature as particularly vulnerable and at the same time particularly pernicious in its effects and associations in American life, because it was seen to underlie the American idea of individualism. That is, loosely, that the individual is the ultimate reality and that society is a construct in the service of individuals, that each individual is, in the final analysis, an end for him or herself, that individual freedom is the appropriate standard by which to measure the success or failure of political systems, and so on. You know, I think everybody has an intuitive idea of what I'm getting at by individualism. The doctrine of a natural right to property was seen as a public nuisance because, among other things, it served as the basis for the development by the Supreme Court of a doctrine come to be called substantive due process, which was used to strike down at both federal and state levels many of the efforts that the progressives had put in place to control, regulate, and otherwise get a hold of the economy. I want to focus for the rest of my talk on the idea of the state of nature, or as it is expressed in the Declaration of Independence, the claim that all men are created equal. This doctrine was held to have practically bad effects because it was theoretically defective as philosophy. And how is it defective? Let me mention, it's an imposing enlightenment. Let me put it as strongly as possible to start. According to the critics, the basic Lockean narrative about the origins of government is just nonsense. Okay, just nonsense. That's the most firm way to put it. The idea of human beings beginning in a state of nature, that is, a state without society, a state without government, is completely fanciful. Human beings, the argument goes, are thoroughly social beings, to say nothing of anything else. They require much aid from each other merely to survive, whatever Daniel Defoe's novel, Robinson Crusoe, may say to the contrary. One reason for this is the nature of human childhood. Human children mature much more slowly. They remain relatively helpless for a much longer time than other animals, and thus they require a kind of social support that many other animals do not need. Then there's that old story of Prometheus and Epimetheus. Is this a story that's familiar at all? How many of you have actually? Story of Prometheus? Okay, well, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but there's a story about, it's a story that notices that when the various gifts of nature were passed out to the different animals, human beings seem to be greatly shortchanged. We seem to be greatly shortchanged. We didn't have natural covering to protect us against the elements. We didn't have sharp claws with which to fight enemies. We didn't have sharp teeth with which to do the same. We weren't all that fast in a broader range of things. We weren't all that strong. In other words, we're really quite ill-equipped in the struggle for survival. And the story of Prometheus goes that, Prometheus noticed this and gave human beings certain kinds of gifts. And the big gift, let's say, is that human beings have the gift of reason and speech. And from these gifts, they develop arts which extend their powers well beyond their natural powers. However, these gifts, reason, speech, the arts, these work only in social settings. Thus, human groups are far more effective than human individuals at hunting, whatever activity you can think of. But there is more to this critique even than the non-survivability of isolated individuals in a state of nature. Human beings, the argument goes, are inherently social. They have speech or language as a defining feature. And language is unthinkable without society. Human beings without language, and thus without society, could not be human. So even if there were pre-human things, whatever you want to call them, who live an asocial life, they are not human, and thus do not enter into any story that would really be relevant to humans. So the whole Lockean construct makes no sense. Moreover, it was increasingly recognized, and if you take a biology course today, I think you probably hear about this, even animals live a much more social life than the state of nature seems to posit. And if animals do, at least many animals, if not all, then it is certain that the original humans must have done so also. Beyond that, the whole narrative of the coming together of isolated human beings in a state of nature to make government via a social contract is equally nonsensical. How could these isolated beings communicate with each other when they don't have language? How would they come together to make their contract? Who or what would gather them together? How could they have a town meeting without a town? In a word, the whole thing was ridiculous. A fiction so fictitious as to be more useless for understanding anything about human society than the most outlandish fairy tales. So now, in the wake of critiques like this, new intellectual systems rose up that purported to give better guidance to social and political life than the political philosophy of John Locke. Disciplines like sociology, which took as its starting point not the individual, but society. In fact, the pioneering sociologist named Émile Durkheim, a French sociologist from early in the 20th century, argued, for example, that Locke and the other state of nature theorists had things exactly backwards. It is society that produces individuals, and not individuals who produce society. Now, this critique, which I've just given, I think, is a powerful one. And it is, to a large degree, responsible for the dislodgement of Lockean thinking about the fundamentals of politics. We no longer, when we pick up a new constitution, say, written by a state, or when we read texts written about politics, we no longer find that basic Lockean story the matter-of-course way of describing what's going on in political life. And that's one of the things, I think, that divides us from the founding generation. That is, the founding generation accepted as a matter of course this basic Lockean story. We no longer do. So, my question at this point is this. Can this Lockean story, can this story about the state of nature, the social contract, and all the rest of it, be salvaged from this critique? I think the answer is yes. I want to begin my attempt to salvage that story by asking this. Does Locke mean his story about the state of nature to be historical? That is to say, descriptive of what actually happens at some time in human history? Well, Locke goes out of his way in many places in his text to say, yes, he does mean it to be historical, descriptive. He defines the state of nature, for example, those of you who read Locke will, I'm sure, recognize this, as a condition of, I'm quoting, men living together without a common superior on earth, with authority, who has authority to judge between them. It is a very common experience, he says, that there are men in such a state. He gives one example, the example of all princes and rulers of independent governments all over the world. They are in a state of nature with each other. Or, another example, two otherwise unconnected men who meet on a desert island. Or, as he says, a Swiss and an Indian in the woods of America. These are all men in a state of nature. And if Locke had been around in the 21st century, he might have added the survivors of the plane crash on Lost. But then again, John Locke was among those survivors and knew their situation very well. Now, from these examples, Locke concludes, I'm quoting here, the world never was nor ever will be without a number of men in that state. Okay? So Locke's state of nature is meant as a real historical situation. No doubt about it. However, the examples that Locke gives are not the sort that prove the historicity of his main storyline. That is, of all men starting out in a state of nature and making a social contract and so on. The examples he gives are clearly exceptions to the way the normal run of men live. And the examples all take for granted as a background condition the existence of political communities such as the rulers of independent communities rule. All the critique of the state of nature thinking that I mentioned earlier could be correct, and still Locke would be right to say that heads of state, men on a desert island, and so on, are in a state of nature. But that, of course, says nothing about the main issue that's at stake. Now, so another way to understand the state of nature doctrine is to see it as a purely hypothetical doctrine, not at all historical. As one recent, and I think very good book, Locke put it, the state of nature is like a thought experiment. Imagine away the state, that is government, and see what happens as a way of coming to understand what difference government and the state make in human life. This idea is not sufficient either, I think, for it misses out on the main thing that Locke uses his state of nature social contract narrative to establish, that being the outlines of the legitimate state. His is an extremely normative theory, and I'll try to explain why that's so in a bit. So while the theory of the state of nature as a merely hypothetical construct does indeed save Locke from the criticisms of the state of nature that were leveled against it, it does not capture his actual use of the doctrine. So let me put forward a third idea that I think does absolve Locke from the criticisms and fits his own agenda better. I don't have a really good term for it, so I'm going to call it a conceptual account, in contrast to what I call the historical and the hypothetical accounts. To understand this conceptual account, we have to step back a bit and remind ourselves of Locke's chief affirmations about the state of nature, and those are really two. It is, first of all, a state of equality and freedom, by which he means a state where there's no authority, a state where nobody has the right to rule or to command others. That's first, freedom and equality. This is actually just another way of saying it's a condition where there's no common superior. There's no common superior because there's no superior at all. Okay, that's his word. When Locke calls the situation where there is no superior the natural state, he is saying that authority, or the right to rule or to govern, is not a natural authority, not something natural. His notion of the state of nature is thus a thoroughly normative one. That is, it's meant to be a claim about what's rightful or not. It does not say anything about whether men live in society or not, or whether men live under others who command or rule them. What he is saying is something about where authority comes from, rather than, and what its nature is, rather than something about the historical situation. Now, what Locke is saying then is that neither God nor nature directly produce authority or the right to rule. There are no natural or divine right rulers, and Locke is famous for having attacked the idea of divine right. Now, the next question then is, why does Locke say this? And to answer that question, I think we have to notice the other main feature of his description of the state of nature. It is not only the state of equality and freedom, etc., but it's also a state in which human beings possess rights. There is no rule by nature, but there are rights by nature. That's important claims. And what are these rights? Well, there's the famous triad that you've all heard of: life, liberty, and property. Men have a right to these three things, which Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, summed up by calling for identifying something he called the right to the pursuit of happiness. That is to say, human beings have a right, give an interpretation of what that means. They have a right to give a shape to their own lives such as they believe might lead them to happiness. Okay, it's a very big notion. We have, generally speaking, we have a right to shape our lives in the way that we think will lead us to happiness, which is what we all seek, as Aristotle told us. And I think most of us can accept the idea of human rights, such as Locke affirms here, at least some version of it. We'll come back to that. Now, my claim is that for Locke, the idea of the state of nature follows necessarily from the affirmation of these natural rights. We can understand the relation between the rights and the state of nature in two different but really quite complementary ways, and so I'm going to outline the two ways. To start off, let's think for a moment of what a right is. Okay, what a right in the full sense is. Let's take something far more concrete than Locke's rights. Let's take David Thunder's rights to his car that he's trying to park in the other person's parking place. David's right to his car has two aspects, I think you'll all agree. He has a right, what we might call a morally valid power, to control his car, to do with it what he will, subject, of course, to certain limitations, like he can't, use it to murder other people and so on. Subject to limitations imposed by the rights of others and, in normal cases, the civil law. So he can drive it. He can leave it in that parking place that he purloined from that other person. He can put it in his garage if he likes. He can sell it, or, if he gets really desperate about it, he could take a sledgehammer to it and destroy it. This is what it means for him to be the owner of that car. He has the right to do all these things to it. Just as he has these rights of control over his car, so other people are excluded from these same kinds of rights of control. That is, there's something exclusive about rights. There's something exclusive about rights in the rights possessor. So without David's permission, the rest of you, the rest of us, do not have a right to drive his car, to say nothing about lacking a right to smash it up with a sledgehammer. Although that person, you better watch out for that person who's driving this. In any case, let's transfer this idea to the rights that Locke affirms. We all have a right to life and liberty. This does not mean that anybody else, though, is obliged to give any of us life, whatever that might mean, or even to give us the means to living. But others are obliged not to interfere with our lives. It's a wrong if they interfere with our lives. If that outraged person kills David, that's a wrong. That's a wrong because it interferes with David's right to his life. More generally, we note that life depends on the body, so that the right to life must translate into a right of bodily integrity, a part of which has to be an immunity against others interfering with one's body, or, as related to the right to liberty, interfering with one's actions. That is, the basic rights of individuals translate into immunities against others using violence or coercion on them. But as Locke points out early in the second treatise, and you may all remember this when he defines political power or authority is precisely the right to command and apply coercion. That's exactly what political power is, the right to apply coercion. If we all possess these natural rights, and thus a natural immunity from the application of coercion, then it cannot be that there is natural authority, because natural authority, which would be the right to apply coercion against us, would be a negation or a denial of what, if in fact, is the case if we are rights possessors, i.e. that we have an immunity against the application of coercion against us. We can look at the relationship between rights and the state of nature in yet another way as well. Taking Jefferson as a good interpreter of Locke, we can say that the basic rights sum up to a right to pursuit of happiness. Now, such a comprehensive right as that means that I, or any of us, have a comprehensive right to give a shape to our own life, as I already said. If we have such a right by nature, then that is incompatible with someone else having natural authority over us, because if someone has a right to rule us by nature, then we do not have the right to give our own lives its own comprehensive shape, so long as, for example, we don't interfere with others. Thus, starting with the idea of rights as including immunities from interference and coercion, or simply with the idea of the right to pursuit of happiness as a comprehensive right of self-direction, we end up in the exact same place. That is, the claim that nature does not and cannot supply authority, or that no one has a natural right to command and coerce others, and all have a right to command themselves. In other words, if we have natural rights, we are created equal, that is, in a state of nature. This is a conceptual beginning point derived from a reflection on the moral situation of human beings as possessors of natural or human rights. Now notice that this is not an historical account, nor is it a mere hypothesis. It's a description of a basic moral reality. The nature of moral reality is such that political power, government or the state, must be conceived to be artificial. That is something which is made. And Locke will go on to show that it's made via consent or social contract. Now, just how we should understand the contract or the consent is something, a subject for another lecture, which I'm not going to produce right now. Suffice it to say that Locke shows that human beings can rightfully consent to only certain sorts of political authority. It cannot be, for example, absolutist, that is, they can't give to government complete authority over themselves. It cannot be indifferent to the basic rights of its citizens. Indeed, it must be devoted first and foremost to securing these rights. It must be government devoted to liberty and embodying the consent of the government. These things follow from the basic story Locke is telling. In its normal form, then, the Lockean doctrine of the state of nature and of rights points to the sole, or at least the dominant legitimacy of the kind of regime we have come to call liberal democracy. That is, liberal democracy follows from the Lockean theory. The American founders were the first in the world to follow out the implications of the Lockean philosophy and to create an almost legitimate, fully legitimate government. They fell short, of course, in at least one very important way. The institution of slavery was a violation of rights and an exercise of authority that could not be legitimate on Lockean grounds. Now, please note here that this conceptual account of the state of nature does not require that we think of human beings in the state of nature understood as a literally historical condition of asociality. Locke knows that human beings are and always have been in society, always have been social beings. He knows that human beings have almost always lived under institutions vested with political power. But he also knows that men have often misunderstood their true natural condition or their true moral claims. And they have most often, up to his time, lived under and accepted false claims to rule and have constructed the wrong sorts of government. Once we understand the moral situation of human beings, he tells us, once we understand it better, we can establish public and political institutions that correspond better to that true moral situation. That is what the Americans believed that they were doing when they took Locke as their guide in making what James Madison called, in Federalist number 14, a revolution which has no parallel in the annals of human society. And then, as he says, they went on to rear fabrics of governments which have no model on the face of the globe. That is, they became phenomenal innovators on the basis of these Lockean thoughts. Now, so far as we still understand ourselves as possessors of basic natural and human rights, we should be able to endorse the basic Lockean, Jeffersonian story about the state of nature and the social contract, even though we never lived in a state of nature and never actually signed a social contract. If we have rights, we were, as Jefferson says, born equal, born into a state of nature. All of us, not just our long ago ancestors. So on that note, I say farewell fellow natives of the state of nature. Thank you. So I don't know what the drill is. We're going to
We have
questions.
yeah, 20 minutes. I think we have about 20 minutes for questions. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Are there any? Nobody has a question? Wow. Yeah.
Any take on whether or not substantive due process was an appropriate application of the Lockean property principle, or not?
That's a good. That's a real good question. I mean, it's not Locke himself. How should I say? There are two dimensions to the question. One would be, is there a philosophic, let's say, principle of political justice that would say there are limitations of the sort that the substantive due process doctrine identified to what is rightfully done with regard to property? There's a second question, which is it rightful that courts ought to be vehicles for applying that? Now, Locke himself does not endorse that second one at all. I think he does endorse the first one in a general way, that we have certain rights and government ought to act to secure those rights and not to violate them, and certain kinds of legislation would be violative of rights, and therefore those things shouldn't happen. That's an abstract doctrine. He has no enforcement of that, whatever. The Americans introduce a new idea in the Lockean scheme beyond what Locke had, and that's the idea of judicial review and a written constitution, these two things which are different from Locke. And that gives, I would argue, some ground for the substantive due process doctrine. But it becomes, it's even then not a straightforward thing because of what role, then we get into the question of the 14th Amendment and what it particularly validates. The short answer, I think, is yes, there's some good Lockean ground for it, as modified by the candidates. Okay. It's funny, I just finished writing a paper on this topic. On Justice Field, if you know Justice Field's work. And it's meant to be an attempt to tease out what Field's doctrine was, how he got from Lockean affirmation of rights to something like substantive due process. So I could send you that. That's a fuller account than I'm able to give here. So. Yeah, sir.
I'm wondering if you'd be...
One story is, let's say, I hope these things work. And actually he does tell elsewhere in the early parts of the first treatise, the second treatise, a kind of historical story that is an evolution of government out of families and out of small monarchies and so on. And that's the story that has, let's call that the historical, the sociological story, the story of the actual evolution of government. But then he also tells what I've called the conceptual story. And what he wants to say is that this historical story, there's the actual history that occurred. The actual history that occurred is not necessarily a morally legitimate history, okay? It happened when human beings didn't understand exactly what they were doing, okay? Now we understand what we're doing, and what we're going to do is use our insight. They've created this thing, government here. We're going to use our insight into the true character of government in order to remake, reform, make over the government that evolved without benefit of the true knowledge. So, in a way, Locke already, the critique that Hume and others raised, I mean, Locke was already aware that this is not an actual historical account of the way things happened. He has his own sort of mini sketch of that. It's not really well worked out, but so what he's wanting to do is something actually rather different from that. It's something at this. It's a more strongly, I would say, normative thing. This is the way government should be made. We're giving us new ideas about legitimacy, and as I said, the implication that the Americans drew, and I think rightly so, that what we call liberal democracy would be the right kind of government, even though most governments have evolved quite differently. So I think that's his response to that kind of
But it's your response.
Well, yes, that's fair enough, because he wasn't there to respond. Right. I'm extrapolating from Locke.
But the effect of this is to declare all previous governments illegitimate.
Yes, I think that's the, if you want to be hard-nosed about it, that's right, right. That there's a claim to remake them all, yes. And I mean, that's the conclusion that many of, Jefferson goes to Paris and looks at the French government and concludes, yeah, it should be remade, we should have a revolution, and France is only one example of all the places that need to be changed. Yeah,
On sort of piggybacking on that, I wonder if you could spell out a bit more explicitly the meaning of this notion of legitimacy, right? Because in one sense, legitimacy is a notion that arises out of political life, right? But in that sense, it's an intra-political notion, right? So you can talk about legitimate succession, for example. Right? So, in a sense, I guess one way of posing the question would be, can you, if you want to make that a kind of extra-political notion by which you judge a political order as a whole, how can you do that? And maybe one angle on that would be, could you do that in any way other than theologically? That is, with some kind of notion of, of natural law or divine law or something.
First, I think, in fact, if legitimacy originally meant intra-governmental, intra-political, as you suggest, I think for now, by us, it no longer means that. I think it's a transcendent standard of judging the rightfulness. The moral rightfulness maybe would be a way to capture it. The moral acceptability of different kinds of rule. So I think that's basically the way I'm using it. That's what Locke doesn't use the term legitimacy. That's our term that I'm projecting back onto him. But I think that's what he's talking about. What makes government morally legitimate? He begins again, I want to emphasize this point. I'm not sure it came across as clearly as I hoped it would in my presentation. The beginning point is the moral illegitimacy of coercion. Coercion always needs defense. Coercion always needs justification. And what Locke argues is that there's no general, authorization of some persons to coerce other persons. There's no such general authorization. All people have basic rights, which include a right against coercion. And government being essentially coercive power, we need to have a way to account for how that could morally acceptably come about. That's the story Locke is trying to tell. And so that's a story, I'm going to translate that as, that's a story about legitimacy. When are governments legitimate in that sense, that they are have a moral right to coerce? The second part of your question had to do with theology. Is there a way to arrive at a theory of legitimacy other than theologically? Well, that's a good question. Because in Locke, one thing I didn't do, nobody's yet pinned me on this one, but I took for granted one thing, and that is that human beings are rights possessors. I did not try to give an account of how Locke or others might defend that idea, because it's maybe not a self-evident truth. I think it's a truth that we tend to accept, and I took that as a good enough beginning point for a conversation here. So Locke has at least one account of how it is that we're rights possessors, and once he gets that, he's able to get everything. One account is that we're rights possessors largely. It's a kind of interesting indirect argument. The argument goes like this. Locke thinks he knows, reason can show him, that we are the products of an omnipotent creating God. All right, God has made us. We are all, as he says in one place, those who study this stuff may remember this, we are all the workmanship of one God, etc., etc. And from that, Locke makes the following conclusion. Since God made us, and especially since he made us out of nothing, he owns us. Okay, he owns us. Now that seems like an odd claim, and an odd claim from which to derive rights, but he derives rights the following way. Since we all belong to God, anytime anybody infringes on our bodies, on our actions, on our being in any way, interferes with our survival or actions, that person is infringing on a right that God has. just as, you know, I don't have the right to go take a sledgehammer to David's car, I also don't have a right to take a sledgehammer to David, because David belongs to God, and I am violating God's right in David, in effect, if I interfere with him in that way. Now, in a derivative way, we might then conclude, well, David has now actually got a right against me. I mean, ultimately, it's a right relative to God, but derivatively, it's also a right against me. I mean, in other words, I don't have a right to interfere with him, or he has an immunity against me, against my use of coercion against him, and therefore we can say, as a implication of God's ownership of all of us, we are all also rights possessors vis-a-vis each other. Vis-a-vis each other. Rights possessors are the kind of rights that Locke identifies. And once we've got that, Locke is able to tell the story that he wants to tell. So that would be one theological ground that Locke would in fact appeal to make his case. I at least argue in my own work on Locke. This is again, every diagram looks the same. We can just fill in the titles differently. That we have here the story of God's ownership. That's one story Locke tells. And Locke tells another story, which is the story of self-ownership, that we also are owners of ourselves. And the interesting thing about them is that both stories get us to the same place. They both lead to the same set of rights. And my own view on, I mean, it's hard, one of the big questions in Locke literature is, well, how are these two stories meant to relate to each other? The story of that we all belong to God, or the story that we belong to each other, because they seem to be kind of they're contradictory. They're not the same story. And what I'm inclined to think about this, and there are again many different answers given by different Locke scholars, what I'm inclined to say is that Locke, I think of this as Locke's wager. Locke thought that this argument for divine ownership could work as a valid argument if and only if he could prove the existence of God rationally, the existence of a creating God rationally. And Locke, for those of you who have really wandered far afield in your young lives, in his book, The Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Locke attempts to provide a proof for the existence of God. I'm supposed to read? Okay. And in, I have to say about that proof, I don't think there's any scholar who's ever read it who thinks it's valid. Now there's a question, what did Locke think of it? What did Locke think of it? And I don't know what Locke thought of it, actually. But I have the following suspicion, that Locke suspected it had some holes. Locke suspected it had some holes. So he would have loved to have that argument as the basis for his whole philosophy, but he wasn't sure that it worked. So he tried to work out another argument that would be independent of it. That is, would be independent of the requirement of a rational proof for the existence of God, a rather difficult thing to establish. And so he developed an argument based on the self-ownership argument, which the two, again, he says, take your choice. I prefer the divine ownership argument. I'm not sure it works, so here's another one that's a kind of fallback position. And they get us to the same position. They get us to the position of basically basic rights. So.
Well, because a marketing class is supposed to be in here very soon, I guess we'll have to adjourn on Lockean grounds of property. Thank you very much, Dr.